As our group traveled up through Spain, then into Ireland and Northern Ireland, we saw many incidences of an us versus them mentality. These cultures showed this mentality through their nationalism and their embracing of their own cultures. In the year 711 AD, the Muslims were successful in their expansion into the majority of Spain. From that year until their expulsion in 1492, there was a consistent sense of us versus them as the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic populations each developed a firm sense of nationalism unique to their separate communities. While the populations experienced a period of post-violence for a time, this was partly due to the cartography and the cities through the separate sectors the Christians and Jews were confined to. The Muslim overlords were permitted into whatever part of the city they liked, while the other faith-based communities were in what is referred to as their separate quarters. This separation provided an environment in which strong but distinct nationalisms prospered. Examples of this division are clearly seen throughout Spain in cities such as Cordoba and Segovia. This us versus them mentality was further perpetuated through the use of buildings and architecture. As most easily viewed in Cordoba, the Muslims constructed a beautiful mosque over a Visigoth worship center when they arrived in Spain. Once the Christians eventually rebelled against the others of the Muslims, they built an equally as beautiful cathedral within that mosque. These two entities are clearly quite different in architectural choices. Architecture has been used throughout the centuries to make physical statements. Thus, through the markedly different design choices found within one area in Cordoba, it is clear that Christians viewed themselves in a different light than the Muslims, and that both cultures showed that physically through their architecture once they came into power. The distinct communities were also nurtured through the nationalism associated with language. The language of Christians became Latin, Jews used Hebrew, and Muslims used Arabic. These languages were incorporated into buildings and communities which can still be viewed today and were the fundamental core to the sacred literature of their respective faiths. The existence of distinct tongues allowed each community to feel a sense of belonging within their own area. The sacred literature in each community was revered, and the fact that the Muslims, Christians, and Jews didn't share in that together only worked to further perpetuate the us versus them mentality. Disparity between the different communities also contributed to the us versus them mentality. Muslim communities were able to benefit from heavier purses with the money to build grand buildings such as the Alhambra, while the Christians and Jews had far less political and economic opportunities. In fact, laws ensured that those of a Christian or Jewish background were not permitted to hold high political office. This allowed resentment to grow within the less economically and politically fortunate communities. Christian, Jews, and other monotheistic faiths were permitted to practice their faith freely, so long as they did not proselytize. While that is more than can be said of the complete religious intolerance experienced under Christian rule in several hundred years, it is still only toleration. This means that faiths and communities beside Islam were purposely made to feel inferior. Not surprisingly, this created tension and resentment between the us of those who had been on the land before the Muslims and the them of the invaders who would only allow a sense of toleration in what Christians and Jews felt was their area. These sense of nationalism and community grew apart as economic and political disparity, conquest, and religious toleration came into play, and the us versus them mentality became far more aggressive as a result. The city of Toledo today houses exhibits in which the brutal conflict between the Christians, Jews, and Muslims is described. There were years of war as Christians in the north began to gain power and take over strategic cities. By that time, deep hostilities between the adversaries in war had developed, and following the Christian overtaking, a period of religious intolerance was enacted. The Basque country consists of territories within France and Spain and the Basque Autonomous Community. However, most of these people desire to have their own independent and united nation. They justify this desire by fostering an us versus them narrative and establishing a sense of nationalism among their people. The Basques do this by focusing on their unique shared language, history, culture, and accomplishments, and the differences between their culture and the Spanish culture, in order to perpetuate a sense of us versus them. Even though they've been around since Roman times and for a majority of time ruled themselves, Basque nationalism did not begin until Spain became the them and Euskal Herria became the us. After Spain became one united nation and claimed the Basque region as part of this newly united Spain, the Basques began to develop an us versus them mentality against the nation of Spain and develop their own nationalism. Throughout history, the Basque have always resisted their occupiers through military force and cultural resistance. And even though in 1978 the Spanish government gave the Basque region some autonomy, this was not considered to be enough by many, and some extreme separatists like ETA continue to fight for an independent Euskal Herria through protest and violence. The Basque language Euskara is the cornerstone of the Basque cultural identity. It is the largest unifying factor among these people. The language itself is very unique. It is not related to Spanish or French at all. Many scholars claim that Basque is likely to be the oldest living European language, which is something they take great pride in. The Basque use their language as a means through which to perpetuate the mentality of an us versus them. Their shared language unites them in nationalism, and they proudly display their language everywhere, even though the Spanish government also requires them to use Spanish, the official language of Spain, on road signs and other official documents. Under Franco's rule, speaking Euskara was banned and became illegal, as it was considered to be a sign of separatism. But when the regime ended and the people were free to speak Basque again, they had been teaching their children and speaking it in secret, and therefore there was a huge revival of their language. The Basque used their cultural background in contrast to traditional Spanish culture in order to emphasize us versus them, and consequently establish their own national identity and have legitimate nationalistic claims. They have their own music and their own dancing. The Basque pagan religious origins were used as an excuse to persecute them during the Inquisition, and the Basque witch trials were some of the largest witch trials in history. This persecution during the Spanish Inquisition contributed to the Basque and the Spanish viewing each other as the others and creating an us versus them attitude. Even though this religion is no longer practiced in Basque society, some symbols are still used today, including the Basque cross. Additionally, aspects of Basque summer festivals reference their pre-Christian religion. Another way they unite together against the Spanish and band together as a nation is through sports, specifically football. The Basque are very proud of their football team, Athletic Bilbao, and only allow Basque to play on it. Whenever they defeat Madrid, there is an extreme amount of pride, and Athletic Bilbao flags are displayed all over the country. The sports victory of the Basque against Madrid symbolically represent their desire to have victory over Spain by becoming fully independent. The Republic of Ireland has dealt with a lot in the past years of its history, and the us versus them mentality has played a key role in observing the events that this country has dealt with, and also seeing how they have shaped the country's sense of nationalism. With the struggle of keeping its independence from Britain and attempting to keep Northern Ireland as a part of the Republic, Ireland has really had no choice but to keep an us versus them mentality in order to preserve their national identity. During the 12th century, England was known as one of the biggest and most powerful countries in Europe. However, the one territory that it longed for was the many kingdoms of Ireland. King Henry II decided it was time to claim this region back, and with the support of Pope Adrian IV, there was nothing that stood in England's way. However, despite the fact that England gained the territory back, this event in history would cause thousands of years of conflict between the Irish and the English. This historical event would start the us versus them mentality that is still prevalent today. Henry VII decided to confiscate the land in Ireland and turn it into something called plantations. These were essentially plots of land that were taken from Gaelic residents and given to English colonists or planters. Although these plantations were eventually abolished, the existing British Protestant areas were still alive and well and would last all the way until modern day. This caused a bitter feeling in the Catholics and created bitterness towards those who identified as British or Protestant. This is yet another example of the us versus them mentality that was created between the English and Irish throughout history. Shortly after this process left Ireland, Protestants dominated the demographics of Ireland's population. Many unsuccessful revolts against English rule committed by the Irish Catholics resulted in more of their land taken and given to Protestants. This was the straw that broke the camel's back in Irish history because they harbored so much resentment for the British that they now saw it was time to fight back. The us versus them mentality just continued to grow stronger as the British took more and more liberties with the Irish. The proclamation of the Republic was the beginning of Ireland's us versus them mentality towards both the North of Ireland and the United Kingdom. The proclamation granted Ireland its provisional government and made them a separate governing body from Great Britain. The fighting that would ensue between the Republic and the North of Ireland for the next few decades would only create a greater sense of nationalism, thus widening the gap between the Republic and the North. The us versus them mentality was fostered by both the signing of the proclamation and the creation of the Rising. Essentially, the Rising started as a protest, but as soon as British troops got in to put the rebellion down, things got violent. After the rebellion's violence was quelled, over 3,000 people were arrested and close to 1,400 people were imprisoned. This rebellion further separated Ireland and England from one another, therefore increasing the us versus them mentality that the Irish harbored. This separation would set up Ireland for its future conflicts with the British, the Troubles. The Troubles, with a capital T, in Northern Ireland, defines the conflict between the Protestant loyalist and the Catholic nationalist. At the peak of the violence in the 70s, a person could get shot for walking down the wrong side of the street or displaying the wrong flag. Neighborhoods were sectioned off with peace walls, which grew to be over 20 feet tall. There was and is a definite us versus them mentality prevalent in Northern Ireland. In response to the Easter Rising and the unrest that followed, Britain and the IRA divided Ireland into two countries. On December 6, 1921, the new Free State of Ireland was made up of 26 of the original 32 counties, and the other 6 became Northern Ireland. This separation did not end the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. In Northern Ireland, the us versus them became even more pronounced. When the new Parliament building was dedicated in 1932 at Stormont, it was declared a Protestant building for a Protestant rule. By 1968, discrimination against the Catholics was widespread and devastating. The Civil Rights Association was formed. Catholics were being discriminated against in housing, education, employment, and job and voting rights. This resulted in many extended Catholic families living in the same small housing unit. This situation led to gerrymandering by the Protestants. The Parliament ruled that the only two adults per household had a vote, and if the housing unit was owned by someone else, usually Protestant, they got one of the votes. On October 5, 1968, the NICRA held a march in Londonderry. It happened to also coincide with a march led by the Protestant fraternal group called the Apprentice Boys. The NIRC was met by the Royal Ulster Constabulary and blocked from marching into Protestant areas. A riot ensued. This resulted in the area of Free Derry being created outside the walls of Derry in the Catholic sections. Residents built and patrolled barriers to prevent the RUC from coming in. Tensions built, and in August of 1969, another march by the Apprentice Boys set off days of violence and rioting, which is now called the Battle of the Bogside. After the Battle of the Bogside, the Northern Ireland government called in British military for assistance, and no-go areas and peace walls were erected, which resulted in more separation. Internment began in 1971, and over 2,000 Catholics were arrested and held without trial on suspicion of terrorism. Paramilitary groups on both sides began gaining strength and status. The IRA and the more radical Provisional IRA on the nationalist side, and the UVA and the more radical UDA on the loyalist side, both contributed to the bloody conflict that continued until the late 1990s. On January 30, 1972, the rioting and violence came to a head. A peaceful protest was planned in Londonderry, even though the Parliament and British had outlawed them. The British Army called in paratroopers in advance to deal with this insurgents. The march began peacefully, but when the route was blocked, the protesters moved behind the barricades at the Free Derry borders. A few youth behind the barricades threw rocks, and the British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 13 and wounding 13 others. No shots were fired or weapons were used against the soldiers, even though they had used that as their reasoning for firing into the crowd. One man was shot in the back and then again at close range to make sure he was dead. Another man was shot with his hands in the air. The dead were all males ranging between 17 and 41. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. This is a letter that is hanging in the Free Derry Museum in Londonderry, Northern Ireland. It is written by a British soldier to the family of the young man who was paralyzed by a shot to his back. Then the soldier walked up to him and shot him again in the back of the head. The letter states that he has no regrets for his action and goes on to say very vile and derogatory things about the young man and his association with the IRA. This, if nothing else, shows the definite feelings of us against them. By 1981, there were thousands of prisoners in internment camps, and Margaret Thatcher had declared that they would no longer be held as political prisoners or given prisoner of war status. 10 prisoners went on a hunger strike to protest this. One of the prisoners was poet Bobby Sands. While he was in prison, he was elected to the Parliament. Unfortunately, he died as a result of the hunger strikes, and this set off protests and memorials across the world. This put the Troubles into the world spotlight. In 1993, negotiations began for the Sunnydale Peace Agreement, but it fell through. At 5:30 p.m. on Friday, the 10th of April, 1998, The two governments and the political parties in Northern Ireland reached an agreement. Political prisoners were released, British troops withdrew from Northern Ireland, and a shared power system for Parliament is negotiated. This shared power system means that no one party could control the Parliament. However, not everyone was in total agreement with this arrangement, and it was 7 more years before the IRA agreed to lay down their weapons. All of this work towards a post-violent society and reconciliation effort should have reduced the us against them mentality in Northern Ireland and Spain. But unfortunately, there is still a huge amount of contention between the culture in both these areas. In Northern Ireland, there are still peace walls separating the communities, and bonfires are lit every year which embrace anti-Catholic and nationalist mentality. In the Basque country, the Basque people still ascertain their separation in culture, society, and even physical aspects from the rest of Spain. Each individual culture sees themselves